The day my father died, the sky was gray and heavy, pressing down on the compound like it had been waiting for this moment, holding its breath with the same deliberate patience that I had learned to cultivate over the years. I stood at the edge of the veranda, my hands gripping the cold iron railing, feeling the chill creep into my bones as if it were seeping through the cracks of my carefully constructed life. From below, the servants moved with muted efficiency, their quiet footsteps across the polished marble floors echoing in the hallways that had once smelled of mahogany polish, my mother's perfume, and the faint metallic tang of our wealth. I had returned from Accra the night before, late, watching the familiar city skyline blur past the taxi window, and now the compound felt both alien and suffocating, as if it had been waiting for me to fail, waiting to remind me that I was still the child who had never truly belonged. Inside, the funeral arrangements were in chaos. Cousins I barely recognized were speaking in hushed, conspiratorial tones, their eyes darting like birds avoiding my gaze. My mother, stoic and fragile all at once, drifted from corner to corner, her shawl tight around her shoulders, lips pursed like a blade ready to cut anything that dared to pass. It was my father's nature to orchestrate everything with precision, yet in death, he had left only the tremors of confusion behind, a labyrinthine puzzle of wills, trusts, and secrets that he had buried under decades of carefully curated smiles and whispered instructions. I had always known that our family was a theater, each member playing their assigned role, each gesture rehearsed, each compliment or insult measured with exacting precision, but seeing it all unravel in real time was something else entirely. It was intoxicating in a way I had not expected, that sharp mix of dread and anticipation that made my pulse thrum with the first real sense of agency I had ever felt in my life. The lawyer arrived at noon, a sleek man with the air of someone accustomed to knowing more than anyone else in the room. He moved like a shadow, briefcase clutched to his chest, eyes sharp and unblinking, and when he spoke, the words were a knife wrapped in silk. The will, he said, had been revised a month before my father's death. Every asset, every property, every account had been redistributed in a way that made no logical sense. The largest portion went to Victor, my oldest cousin, the one who had spent his life grinning and charming, pretending to be loyal, always too perfect for anyone to suspect him. He leaned against the wall with that infuriating, careless air, sipping champagne as if he had been promised the empire in some private ceremony, as if the rest of us were extras in his story. I felt my stomach twist, a slow, bitter burn curling through my chest, a sensation I had known only in fragments before. The law allowed no room for dispute. The papers were valid, notarized, witnesses present. But as I read the document over his shoulder, my eyes catching each line, each clause, each detail, I realized that the betrayal was not just financial, it was existential. My father, the man who had built this empire with his bare hands, had left me nothing. But worse, he had left a question that would gnaw at the foundations of every family gathering for the rest of my life. Why Victor? Why now? Why the secrecy, the meticulous orchestration of my exclusion? The room spun slightly as I stepped back, pretending to adjust the folds of my dress, while Victor laughed softly at some private joke. Around him, the family murmured polite congratulations, hugs exchanged with smiles that never reached their eyes, the air thick with forced civility. I had always been aware of the fault lines in our family. Favoritism, whispered judgments, the unspoken hierarchy that positioned each of us like pawns on a chessboard. But this was a checkmate I had never anticipated. I walked toward the balcony again, letting the wind whip through my hair, and for the first time, I considered the notion that the family I had once idolized was nothing more than a fragile construct, paper thin and waiting for someone to burn it from the inside. I could not sleep. The moonlight spilled into my room in silvery streams, reflecting off the polished floorboards, casting elongated shadows that seemed almost accusatory. I found myself rifling through my father's study, a room I had avoided for years, overwhelmed by the memory of his presence, the scent of old leather and tobacco clinging to the shelves. It was there I found the first clue, the small, innocuous envelope tucked behind the volumes of account ledgers. Inside was a set of DNA results, carefully labeled with names I recognized dates, and a single shocking revelation. Victor was not my father's biological son. The paper trembled in my hands, a whisper of truth so explosive it rendered the rest of the room silent. I sat on the edge of the desk, heart hammering, realizing that the inheritance, the empire, the smiles, the betrayals, all of it rested on a foundation of lies. It was more than financial theft. It was identity stolen, history rewritten, and for the first time, I felt the intoxicating edge of a plan begin to form. The following days were a careful dance. I smiled at family dinners, laughed at jokes I had heard 1,000 times, maintained the decorum of grief, all the while observing, cataloging, mapping the cracks in their armor. My mother's sighs, the way Victor's hand lingered a moment too long on a wine glass, the nervous tick of my aunt as she recounted a family story. Every detail was a thread, and I intended to unravel it all. I hired a private investigator discreetly, tracing financial transactions, confirming long-held suspicions about Victor's entanglements and his role in manipulating my father in the final months of his life. Each piece of evidence I collected was a spark, and I nurtured the fire in secret, knowing that when it ignited, it would consume everything. My evenings were spent alone, reviewing documents, photographs, and recordings I had made of casual conversations, each one carefully noting inconsistencies, each one a breadcrumb leading to the truth. It was exhausting, exhilarating, a dangerous high that made sleep optional. The family, meanwhile, continued their performance, unaware that I had become the silent architect of reckoning. My interactions with Victor were a study in controlled restraint. I greeted him with warmth, engaged in small talk, complimented his choices, all the while cataloging his reactions, memorizing his mannerisms, the way his smug confidence faltered ever so slightly under scrutiny. My anger was quiet, simmering, refined into a tool rather than an outburst, because I had learned long ago that impulsive displays of emotion were for those who lacked patience and vision. Weeks passed. The estate's halls, once echoing only with polite conversations and whispered gossip, now carried the weight of unspoken tension. I could sense the edges of the family fraying, subtle tremors that I had not noticed before, the small cracks in their collective performance widening imperceptibly. One evening, I overheard Victor speaking to an attorney on the phone, his voice laced with arrogance, unaware of my presence. He spoke of offshore accounts, falsified documents, even casual threats to anyone who might challenge his position. The thrill of confirmation surged through me, but I contained it, allowing only a shadow of a smile to touch my lips before retreating to the quiet of my room. It was time to prepare the final act, the culmination of months of observation, collection, and planning. The truth of Victor's origins and his manipulations would not remain hidden. The empire would not remain in unearned hands, and the family, the gilded cage of lies and loyalty, would face the reckoning they had long deserved. The night I chose to act was calm, deceptively ordinary. The servants had retired, the estate's vast halls silent save for the occasional creak of polished floors and the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. I carried with me a folder containing all the evidence I had gathered: DNA results, financial records, audio recordings, photographs of forged documents, correspondence between Victor and his accomplices. The weight of it was both literal and symbolic, pressing against my chest with the promise of justice finally unspooling. I entered the grand drawing room, where Victor lounged carelessly, reading a newspaper as though the world belonged to him, as though he had already won. My steps were measured, deliberate, the sound of my heels echoing in the silence like a metronome, counting down the final moments. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before settling into an expression of practiced charm. "You're up late," he said, voice smooth, but I saw the twitch of uncertainty at the corner of his mouth. I smiled, a gesture both innocent and lethal. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready for tomorrow," I replied, setting the folder on the table with a deliberate weight. His gaze followed my hands, lingering on the documents as though sensing, subconsciously, that they contained more than mere paper. "Everything is ready?" he asked, voice light, but the tension in the room thickened, pressing against both of us. I nodded, calmly. "Everything you think you have, and everything you don't." And in that moment, the quiet thrill of anticipation, the delicate balance of power, and the bitter satisfaction of long-planned revenge all converged. I could see it then, as clear as the polished marble underfoot, that the course had been set. Victor's empire, built on lies, could no longer stand. The family's illusion of unity, their carefully rehearsed smiles, their whispered manipulations, all of it would collapse. The question that remained, and that would shape the nights to come, was whether the cost of victory would leave me triumphant or hollow. I let the silence stretch, each second a drumbeat leading toward the revelation that would change everything. And as I opened the folder, letting the first document spill across the mahogany table, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fire had been lit, quietly, invisibly, in the weeks of careful preparation. And now, at last, the first spark would meet its kindling. Outside, the moon continued its indifferent arc across the sky, casting a pale, silvery light through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts in the air. Inside, the storm I had been cultivating for months waited, patient and inevitable, ready to sweep through the family I had loved, hated, and ultimately chosen to hold accountable. And in that silence, poised between what had been and what was about to be, I realized the truth I had always known but never fully embraced. Revenge was not about satisfaction. It was about inevitability. The pieces were set, the players oblivious, and tomorrow the world as we knew it would fracture in ways they could never anticipate. The papers spilled across the mahogany like a slow confession, each sheet a small, unignorable truth, and Victor's eyes moved over them with the same practiced nonchalance he had always offered the world, an arrogance that now looked like brittle costume rather than armor. I watched him as if I were watching an animal I had been feeding for years finally realize the bait was gone. His features sharpened, the smile slipping, then snapping back as if he could force normalcy by sheer will. I began where I had decided to begin, with the DNA, the most personal shrapnel of identity, the proof that stripped him of the one thing he had always insisted upon, the right to belong. I laid out the test results slowly, as though speed might blur the facts, as though hesitation could conjure miracles. He glanced, then looked away. The others leaned in. I moved through the financial ledgers next, the transfers to offshore accounts in names that matched the signatures I had compared under magnification late into nights, each amount a precise betrayal of the promises made over the years at dinner tables and in whispered prayers. I set down the emails, the texts, the notarized copies of forged signatures that tied him directly not only to greed, but to a quiet campaign of erasure, of my name from inheritance rolls, of my father's true wishes, of family memory itself. The room hummed with the sound of air conditioning and distant city traffic, banal noises that made everything else feel sharper by contrast. Victor's hand reached toward the folder, a reflex maybe to take ownership back by contact, but I folded my fingers over my own, keeping the physical connection, my thumbnail grazing the edge of the paper like a vow. "You always liked to take what wasn't yours," I said, and my voice surprised me. Steady, cold, calibrated. No one attempted to stop the tide. There was no dramatic gasp because there did not need to be. The scandal was a mechanical thing revealed by ink and seal, not by melodramatic confession. Victor's supporters, the ones who had orbited him like small moons, cousins with investments, family friends with shared interests, shifted. Some of their faces were easy to read. Sheepish, annoyed, calculating new positions. Others were stone. My mother's face was a mask I could not read at all. She folded her shawl tighter and closed her eyes for a beat that felt like an accusation. That was when I played the recording, the one I had been saving like a loaded weapon. The weight of it was both literal and symbolic, pressing against my chest with the promise of justice finally unspooling. I entered the grand drawing room, where Victor lounged carelessly, reading a newspaper as though the world belonged to him, as though he had already won. My steps were measured, deliberate, the sound of my heels echoing in the silence like a metronome, counting down the final moments. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before settling into an expression of practiced charm. "You're up late," he said, voice smooth, but I saw the twitch of uncertainty at the corner of his mouth. I smiled, a gesture both innocent and lethal. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready for tomorrow," I replied, setting the folder on the table with a deliberate weight. His gaze followed my hands, lingering on the documents as though sensing, subconsciously, that they contained more than mere paper. "Everything is ready?" he asked, voice light, but the tension in the room thickened, pressing against both of us. The recorder in my coat had captured Victor's voice 2 months prior, sharp and low, arguing with my father, the words clipped and exact, threats couched as bargains, bribery disguised as persuasion, warnings about messing with things that could bring ruin. My father's responses were muffled. I had edited the tape to preserve the poison and excise the pleasantries. The room listened with a curiosity that felt clinical. When the playback ended, silence sat heavy, compromised. Victor recovered first with a laugh that was too loud and too forced, a sound that failed to carry conviction. "You're impossible," he said, the cliché of wounded superiority. "This is spite." "Spite is a convenient word for those without better names," I answered. "Call it justice if you like. Call it exposure. Call it what you need to sleep." I had prepared for denial, for outrage, for legal counters. I had not prepared for the way the family would fracture like glass under a thrown stone, each shard reflecting its own private light. Within hours, the estate buzzed with calls. The lawyer who had once smoothed my father's will like a sacred text now spoke in clipped tones into his phone, his jaw tight. Victor retreated to his room and then to a lawyer's office, to meetings with men whose faces I had seen only in bank photos and business panels. He spoke in defensive cadences about fraud and manipulation, about forged signatures that would require forensic analysis. But evidence is not theory when it is rooted in things a machine can validate. Blood tests, timestamps, IP addresses. I had the receipts for the transfers, the chain of custody for the documents I had seized, the witness statements from a disgruntled former accountant who had been paid to smooth things over, and had finally been pushed too far by guilt or fear. The first headlines hit the next morning, not in the polite pages of society, but in the hungry pixels of online news that delighted in family disintegration. There was a peculiar satisfaction in watching our private grief become public, an ugly, efficient sort of justice, while also recognizing that once the story lived beyond our walls, it would never stop evolving into images and opinions and people's quick judgments. Victor fought like a cornered animal. He produced his own set of documents, lawyers with broad shoulders and glib smiles, claims of an amended will made in good faith, forged signatures presented as legitimate by men who swore by witnesses I had traced and found complicit. He accused me of planting evidence out of spite, of orchestrating the entire leak. That was expected. It was playbook stuff. But then deeper, meaner truths surfaced in ways I had not planned. My aunt, as brittle as porcelain and as blunt as a hammer, produced a letter, old, frayed, written in my father's hand but unsigned, claiming a long-ago promise to Victor's mother, a plea for compassion toward a son who had known hardship. The room pivoted, history rewriting itself on the spot like an improvisational play. My chest tightened. The smell of smoke from some distant kitchen drifted in, and I had to remind myself to breathe. The court of public opinion is not the same as the court of law, and as days blurred into weeks, alliances shifted in their slow tectonic rhythms. Supporters of Victor argued that the DNA could not negate a moral debt, that care and loyalty counted for something beyond blood, that my father, in his wisdom or weakness, had chosen to give. I had seen those arguments in the faces of relatives who needed a reason to accept loss of privilege, and I felt then the cold realization that truth alone would not be enough to heal the fissures. So I moved on to the next plan, one that would not merely expose, but reframe. The shareholders' meeting at the family holding company was a stage set for reckoning. I lobbied quietly among cousins and minor shareholders with a patience I had honed like a muscle, promising transparency, promising audits, promising a future that would not be built on theft. I made friends with people who had been sidelined by Victor's deals, farm managers whose lands had been quietly leased, small contractors who had been squeezed out, one worker in the timber yard who remembered my father's early hands like scripture. I did not speak much in public at first. I let others do the talking, planting seeds of doubt with questions that seemed procedural but were, in their intent, corrosive. At the meeting, Victor rose with the same confidence he always carried, but this time his posture was watched, the room's eyes tracking him like a jury's. He launched into a prepared speech about continuity and stewardship, about honoring my father's memory. He used phrases that had once soothed us all: legacy, family, stewardship, words that had the power to conjure nostalgia and blind logic. I watched him, and then I spoke. My voice did not waver. I began with the personal, not the DNA first, not the accounts, but the stories of people who had been hurt by his management. A foreman who lost his job, a farmer whose contract was bought by a shell company, a nurse whose clinic had been quietly defunded. Small human losses that built a pattern. This was not merely an heir miscast. This was a man whose decisions had consequences beyond our private dining rooms. Then I unfolded the forensic paper trail. Timestamps and transfers, the emails with unambiguous subject lines and IP logs that traced purchases to places far from the estate, the notarized documents that bore the fingerprints of men who had been paid to lie. The room slid from empathy into anger and into disbelief, and then into a kind of hungry, vengeful focus I had not expected. Victor's face crumbled, his words thinned. That afternoon, the company's board voted to suspend him pending an independent investigation. The suspension was symbolic and practical both. It was a public unraveling and a legal stalling. Victor's supporters called foul, claiming sabotage. The press called it high drama. The law moved slowly, but the court of corporate governance had teeth. I felt, briefly, a bloom of triumph so sweet it almost stung. It was not long before Victor retaliated in the single way he had always known how, by striking at what I loved most outside the estate. He leaked a rumor to a tabloid about my marital life, a petty attempt to smear me with the same tools he used to buy silence. People who had not known him suddenly saw his laughably small cruelty for what it was. Friends withdrew with the quickness of those who cannot be bothered to pick up splinters of scandal. I noticed how many relationships in my life were transactional, how quickly support evaporated when the story shifted from corporate malfeasance to personal dirt. That was the real sting. Winning in public meant losing in private. The next blow was the most personal. One night, when the world felt quieter, my mother called me into her small, private sitting room, an act that felt ritual, a summons to old loyalties. She closed the door behind us with a softness that meant she wanted, for once, to speak without the estate's ears. For a moment, I hoped for confession, or at least complicity. Instead, she slid a photograph across the table and looked at me with a clarity I had never seen. It was not the photograph of my father alone, but a picture of my parents at a younger age, arms around each other, in a way that suggested the past was simpler than the present made it. There was a small note on the back: "Take care. Protect him." My heart beat harder at the memory of the note's scrawl. The handwriting was my father's, and the words were suffused with something I could not yet name. Then she spoke, and for the first time in my life, her voice was both resigned and fierce. "I did it to keep us whole," she said. The words cut deeper than any accusation. She told me then, not as an excuse but as an explanation, of the years of quiet bargaining she had done at my father's side, of the bedridden aunt to be placated, of a scandal that would have shattered a young Victor and the family's reputation, of a promise made in panic and love and fear. She had backed Victor, she said, because sometimes family was not about rightness but about survival, about choosing the lesser of two known evils. The confession did not absolve her. It complicated everything. I had imagined a single villain, Victor, slick and greedy, and a single victim, me. My mother's admission smudged those lines. The estate's rot ran deeper, threaded through decisions made by people who had once meant well. There was, too, the hint of coercion in her voice. When I pressed, she told me of a man who had come to the compound years ago, someone who had threatened to expose a secret about our family if we did not help him. That man was a shadow I had not accounted for, an outside pressure that had shaped my father's final months. The revelation drove a stake into the neat arc I had been crafting. The world could no longer be read in black and white. I found, in that instant, that my hunger for retribution was no longer the pure, simple thing I had cherished. Revenge is easiest when motives are uncomplicated. The moment you accept the complexity of human frailty, you inherit its moral fog. I had to choose then whether to press onward or fold like everyone else had. I chose to press, but the cost would be more than I had bargained for. The independent investigation yielded a flurry of subpoenas, and the forensic analysts moved through records like surgeons, excising tissue where corruption had metastasized. Victor's name appeared in wire transfers, but also the names of faceless intermediaries and the signature of the same notary who had handled my father's accounts for decades. The evidence built a case not only for fraud, but for an organized effort to siphon the estate's value into private pockets. The public reaction was a whirlwind. Interviews, late-night pundits, op-eds on the nature of privilege, and the rot of dynastic greed. I sat for a televised panel once and watched my face on screen as though it belonged to a different woman, someone colder, someone who had chosen consequence over comfort. The fallout was mechanical and emotional and constant. Victor was indicted. He attempted, in the days before his arrest, to plead with cousins, to raise money, to barter with creditors. He was a caged thing, making deals with the only currency he had left, lies. On the day the officers came, the manor was emptying in a way I had not seen before. Suitcases rolled across marble floors, addresses were given to drivers. A few brave family members who had chosen neither side disappeared into taxis with faces drained of color. Victor met the officers with a face made for pleading. I watched him as they led him through the great hall, passing the portrait of my father that hung like a lighthouse behind marble columns. People called it poetic justice, a rest at the heart of the empire. But the arrest was only a hinge opening onto a darker room. In court, the prosecutors were steady, their sentences precise. The case was not simply about filthy hands on family assets. It was about calculated erosion of trust, about the weaponization of intimacy. My testimony, the forensic data, the accountant's sworn statement, the emails, they piled like a litany. Victor's face was worn down in public now, a map of humiliation. Yet even then, as judgments were rendered and restitution ordered, I felt no triumphant warmth. The victory, legal and financial, was clean and cold like the metal coins in our vaults. It did not soothe the hollow that had opened inside me. My mother visited him in the cell once, a meeting that I had arranged because I wanted to see the human exchange that followed treachery, whether pity would emerge, whether some shard of the old family might be reclaimed through contrition. She returned shivering and quiet and told me little, but in her pause there was a cinder of sorrow that burned between us. The estate's fortunes were transferred back into oversight panels and trust committees. Accounts were frozen, properties reassessed, contracts renegotiated. Publicly, the family was purged of corruption, reinvested in transparency. The shareholders applauded the new direction, the board chair received accolades, and the press declared a tidy moral arc. Villain exposed, villain jailed, scion rises to clean house. But what the press could not understand, what the company charter could not measure, was the cost to the species of intimacy. Cousins stopped calling. Family dinners became strange affairs with the clink of silverware sounding like small accusations. My mother and I drifted into a new relationship, one made of practical meetings and careful silences instead of warmth and shared jokes. A younger cousin, once a playmate, now looked at me with a caution that felt like grief, as if by winning I had stolen the past as well as the future. In the quiet aftermath, I found myself walking to my father's study at odd hours, as though the room might speak, as though the stacks of ledgers and the smell of old tobacco might tell me what it had all been worth. I found, instead, an emptiness, the velvet cushion of the chair sagging like a long day's work. Nothing left but the echo of a man who had been brilliant and flawed and finally mortal. Perhaps the most dangerous thing I learned was how closely revenge and identity entwined. Pulling at the threads of one altered the fabric of the other. There were nights when I caught myself practicing my expression in polished glass, shaping the stoic mask I thought a leader required. And in those mirror hours, I recognized the person I was becoming. Someone whose gentleness had been tempered into strategy, whose laughter had been bartered for purpose. My victories were measured by contracts and court rulings, but my cost was measured in absence. Childhood friends who had become strangers, a mother who looked at me like someone she no longer recognized, the hollowed-out sense that even my own triumph was somehow made of ash. The last act, the one that would burn the image in our collective memory, came with its own quietness. The manor, the symbol of our name, the repository of portraits and heirlooms and secrets, had to be dealt with. The board recommended selling portions, liquidating assets to repay victims, and to fund charities that would render our name less painful in the public sphere. It was practical and proper and designed to bury shame under good works. But the house had been both prison and altar. It was, for better or worse, the place where my father's life had been lived and where my family's long performance had been enacted. I could imagine no antiseptic solution that would make amends to the people hurt by our greed, and I could imagine no ceremonial burial that would lay the past down gently enough. So I made a choice that startled even me. On a gray morning, much like the one that had welcomed my father's death, I walked into the great hall with a single matchbox in my pocket, the little wooden sticks, a ridiculous, almost childish contrast to the gravity of my intentions. I lit a candle in front of the ancestral portrait, a small act of ritual that felt more necessary than destructive, and then I set the pages of the old family ledger alight, just a corner, then another, watching the flame catch the brittle edges of paper that had recorded names and debts and promises. The flames consumed soundlessly at first, hungry and steady, and then with a suddenness that sounded like a gasp, the room filled with heat and light and the smell of smoke. Alarms began their dull mechanical siren, and shouts rose in a chorus of panic. People ran in a state of animal surprise. Servants grabbed valuables, cousins scooped up heirlooms, and for a wild, miraculous beat, the family that had been broken by lies moved as one, trying to salvage something from the ruin they had all helped create. I stood with my hands empty, the matchbox now just a bit of spent wood between my fingers, and watched the faces around me. My mother at the edge of the doorway, a long time away from my side, her shawl blown about like a flag. Victor, who had returned on a bail hearing and watched the estate he had sought to control ignite, stood in the hall with an expression I could not read: fury, despair, or the clean astonishment of a man whose house had truly burned. There was chaos, firefighters wading in, water spraying, the portrait sagging into a blackened smear. But in the center of the pandemonium, my emptiness crystallized into something else, a recognition that the house was not the person, that a roof could not shield what had been lost, that burning the ledger would not resurrect the past or restore those whom we had hurt. There was a moment, as the sprinklers hissed and the smoke braided with the sunlight, when I thought I would feel relief. Instead, I felt a resolute, cool loneliness, as if the flames had burned away not only papers, but the illusions that had kept me small. The cameras arrived like vultures, late but thorough, and the headlines captured the image they wanted. Heiress burns family legacy in act of reckoning. The narrative shaped itself around a single dramatic frame, a photograph of a woman standing in a rain of ash, her dress darkened, her hair loose, eyes like two chips of flint. People filled the void with meaning. Some praised the symbolic cleansing, others vilified what they called vandalism. But the meaning in the moment belonged to only one person, the one who had seen that the ledger was not the source of justice, and in burning it, had only set her own hands to work. The fire did not, in the end, answer the questions. Victor went to prison, restitution orders were implemented, the company restructured under new, supposedly incorruptible management. Local charities received funds. The timber contracts were renegotiated for fairer terms. Many small things righted themselves in the wake of scandal. But for each correction, there was a private loss that no headline could heal. Friendships severed, a mother's trust frayed, the hollow that sits where childhood should be. In the months that followed, I found myself less interested in control and more in the small, painstaking work of repair. Meeting with foremen and farmers, attending memorials for those who had been hurt, listening to stories I had not wanted to hear when they cost me less. It was a quieter life than I had planned, and yet in it I discovered a kind of small redemption, the slow, imperfect work of making restitution where restitution could be made. On the first anniversary of my father's death, I walked to the gate of the compound and stood where the road widened into the city. watching cars pass, children chasing a stray dog, a man with a tray of roasted plantain hawking his goods with a practiced shout. The portrait of the manor's facade had been boarded up, the smoke-blackened lintel a reminder of the night when the past had finally been forced to speak. I took off the ring I had worn since the funeral, an old family band that had been polished to a bright, untruthful sheen, and I let it fall into the dirt at my feet. It landed with a tiny clink and rested there, a small, unimportant thing at the edge of the road. I walked away without looking back. In the months and years that followed, people would try to write the story neatly, victim and avenger, sinner and penitent. But the truth was less tidy. I had won in courts and in boards, but the price of victory was paid in absence. My mother's voice in the evenings was gentler, but there were silences that widened like cracks. Victor's name was said only rarely now, in a clipped word that had lost its power to wound. The estate's rooms were repurposed, its lands parceled, its portraits thinned. The ledger was gone, charred into a memory that smelled of fire and old paper. On nights when the city was quiet and memory crept near, I would think of the moment the match hit paper, not because I wished to relive the destruction, but because in that small act, I had acknowledged a terrible, necessary truth. Nothing built on lies can be preserved without rot, and sometimes the only way to begin again is to watch what once held you burn. The inheritance had been more than money. It was names and expectations, and a lineage of decisions that shaped lives. I had dismantled it to stop the bleeding, and in that dismantling, I had become both judge and executioner, and also, finally, witness to the ruin that follows a long unspooling of secrets. Standing at the city's edge, the ring in the dirt and the smoke-stained sky behind me, I felt neither triumph nor regret so much as a brittle, resolute clarity. I had taken what was owed in a sense, but the currency of retribution had cost me the last of what I had thought would be my inheritance, a sense of uncomplicated belonging. The wind picked up, lifting dust in thin whorls across the lane, and somewhere a child began to sing. I walked on, the manor a smudge on the horizon, certain at last that what I had done could never be undone, and even more certain that the house I left behind would tell our story differently than we had told it ourselves. The inheritance had burned. Weeks after I left the ring in the dirt, life settled into a rhythm that resembled peace, but was really just fatigue. I had moved into a modest apartment overlooking the edge of the old district, a place where the city hummed with its own kind of anonymous forgiveness. My mornings were filled with work, paperwork mostly, rebuilding small contracts, overseeing the community trust the estate had been forced to fund. The nights were longer, quiet, and it was in those hours that memory crept through the seams of my composure. One evening, a brown envelope arrived, its edges soft with age. There was no return address, just my name written in a careful hand I did not recognize. I might have thrown it away had it not been for the faint scent that clung to it, old tobacco and cedar, the same mixture that had haunted my father's study. My breath caught before I even opened it. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed page of ledger paper, was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's, though unsteady, as if written in haste or at the edge of some reckoning. The date in the corner stopped me cold, 40 years ago, long before my birth, long before Victor's name had ever become a wound. "My dearest child," it began. "If this ever reaches you, it will be because the house has spoken before I could. You will know the name Victor as the boy I called my nephew, but there are things about his blood that were hidden even from him. I write this not as confession, but as preservation, because truth, when buried, grows roots that crack the ground above it." I read those words again and again before continuing. The rest of the letter unfolded like a slow avalanche. My father recounted a time when the estate was younger, when its wealth was still expanding outward, swallowing smaller lands and lives. Victor's mother, Helena, had been one of the estate's bookkeepers, a woman of quiet brilliance and, as my father admitted, one of his earliest mistakes. "She came to me when I was still half a man and twice as foolish," he wrote. "What began as indulgence became a kind of understanding. She carried my child, though I could not allow the world to know it. Your grandfather demanded she marry one of the farmhands to keep the family name clean. The man who raised Victor was not his father. I was. And though I told myself that secrecy was mercy, I see now it was cowardice. I felt the world tilt as I read those words. My fingers tightened on the paper until the edges began to tear. Victor, my brother, the man I had publicly ruined, whose downfall I had orchestrated, whose name I had cursed in every room that mattered, he was my father's son. My blood, my father's account continued. The ink pressed harder, as though he'd been trying to fight the past into submission. Helena died young, he wrote, and Victor never knew. I watched him grow, saw in him flashes of my own arrogance, and could not bring myself to claim him. When he turned against the family, I understood that the cruelty he learned had its first lessons from me. You will learn this truth too late as I have, but know that none of us are free from the debts we inherit. The letter trembled in my hands. The words were alive, pulsing with a history I had spent years misreading. The second page was dated years later, the handwriting shakier, as if my father had written it during his final illness. If the day comes when you seek justice against him, remember this: he is not what he seems. None of us are. My punishment was to watch both my children grow in separate houses of deceit. If you ever find it in yourself to forgive me, do so not for what I did, but for what I failed to undo. I pressed the page to my chest, as if I could will it to stop shaking. Tears came, not for Victor, not yet, but for the realization that the fire I had set had consumed not only lies, but a truth I had never been given. Weeks passed before I could read the final note attached to the letter. It was written in my father's lawyer's hand, dated only a few months before his death. Your father requested that, in the event of a family scandal, a petition for Victor's eventual parole be filed. He did not wish him to return to the estate, but he asked that he be allowed to live free, at a distance. The motion was delayed after your father's passing, and only recently approved by the courts. You may wish to know this. I folded the letter slowly, feeling the air leave my lungs as though the room had closed in. The irony was unbearable. My father had lit the first spark of our ruin long before I ever struck my match. The ledger I'd burned, the trial I'd built, the inheritance I'd dismantled. It had all been a continuation of a story written decades before I was born. For days, I couldn't bring myself to eat or speak. The knowledge changed the texture of memory itself. Every glance my father had given Victor, every dismissal, every offhand cruelty, rewrote itself into tragedy. I thought of Victor in his cell, the light slanting through barred windows, the silence he must have sat in, believing he'd been betrayed by blood that was never his. And now, he was free. One morning, I found myself standing again at the edge of the city, the air thick with dust and the promise of rain. I imagined Victor somewhere far away, a man stripped of titles, perhaps still burning inside the same way I had burned everything down. I wanted to see him, to tell him the truth that should have been his from birth. But my father's last wish held me back. He may live, but never near her. I understood now. The distance wasn't punishment, it was preservation. Still, the ache of unspoken forgiveness pressed against my ribs. I wrote a letter of my own that night, sealing it without an address. It read simply, "I know now who you were, and who we are. The fire wasn't for you, it was for both of us. Wherever you are, live. That will be enough." I left it on the window ledge and watched the wind take it at dawn. Somewhere in the city, perhaps, it found its way to him. Or perhaps not. But for the first time since the flames rose against the manor walls, I felt something.